If you look enough at anything, it will become extremely interesting. If you look very long at anything, it will become rich, manifold, fascinating. If you look at anything for long enough, you will rejoice in the miracle of love. You will possess and be blessed by the marvelous, blinding radiance of love. You will be Radiance. Delmo Schwartz. For more than a century, people have been looking at art at the museums on the Quadrangle in Springfield, Massachusetts.
This complex that we're in here in Springfield in some ways resembles a Greek classical ideal. It goes back to the old concept of Athens, the Acropolis that had the Parthenon theaters, Agora marketplace, etc. This idea of kind of bringing the resources into the center. Here in one space you have a library, an art museum, a cultural center, technology and science center, local history.
We have two art museums here on the Quadrangle, the George Walter Vincent Smith and the Museum of Fine Arts. The George Walter Vincent Smith really provides a snapshot of the 19th century.
The Smith Museum gives the visitor the rare opportunity to view the mix of art and objects that delighted the Victorian mind. Asian artifacts, American paintings of the late 19th century, plaster cast copies of ancient statuary.
Here we have the Venus de Milo. She's in the Louvre in Paris. Here we have the Parthenon Sculpture from the British Museum. And here's a wonderful detail of the altar of Zeus at Pergamum, which is now located in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. So in a sense, in just strolling around the room, we've been to Paris, we've been to London, all without ever leaving Springfield.
At the Museum of Fine Arts, you have a much broader overview of art history. Representative examples from the 18th century up to contemporary time. Beautiful landscapes, portraits, still lifes, contemporary sculpture, contemporary painting.
The museum is a portal into the American past. The objects that you see here are chunks of history, artifacts of history. All of these objects bring the past to life in a very articulate ways, and all at once, too. These pictures have an immediate impact. These works will draw anybody into a particular time and place, into a set of beliefs and values that once existed.
He was the spender, she was the thrifty one. He brought to collecting the boldness that marked his shrewdly brilliant business career. She brought to it the desire to be meticulous. Accustomed to volume, he bought by the carload, armor, ceramics, paintings. Enchanted by the delicate, she bought lace, piece by piece. In a time when the rich routinely stockpiled art for private consumption, George Walter Vincent and Belle Townsley Smith went public. They donated their collection lock, stock, and barrel to the city of Springfield.
These people were generous. I mean, every town doesn't have a complex like this. You go here, there, you won't find them all over. It takes an inspired, enlightened, generous individual to do it.
George Walter Vincent Smith was an inspired individual, a self-made millionaire who had retired from business at the age of 35. With his wife, Belle Townsley of Springfield, he spent 5 decades pursuing his passion, the serious collection of art.
George Walter Vincent Smith loved to buy in quantity. I mean, that was his great success. We have records of just page after page of things that he would buy at a single time. And I think it was a very exciting time to purchase.
The Smiths made their home in Springfield, a city caught in the industrial commotion of the time. The city had 4 newspapers, 6 rail lines, and nearly 700 factories, producing everything from lace to revolvers. The city had an opera house, an 1,800-person theater, and from 1878 on, an art gallery of sorts. Smith helped James Gill, a local stationer, put on exhibitions of some of the most famous American artists of the day. At their first show, they sold 36 paintings at New York prices. But Smith was no art dealer. He and his wife announced their intention to donate their collection to the city. Springfield gladly accepted and built a museum to house it.
Americans wanted to be more tasteful, to go to the symphony, to enjoy the ballet, to understand a work of art. So this was all kind of an educational process of how to take an industrialized America, an immigrant America, and to give us taste and refinement through art and culture.
The Smiths devoted their lives to the museum after its opening in 1896. Smith himself served as curator, exhibiting his own peculiar style to the public.
He often wore Chinese costumes out of the collection. He really took upon the role of a Chinese gentleman. He had hours where people could come into the museum and he would guide them around. And he really wanted to create an environment that showed beauty. He did this by mixing up American painting with Italian painting, with Middle Eastern rugs, with Chinese objects, with Japanese objects, to create these still life arrangements.
George Walter Vincent Smith died at age 90 in 1923. 10 years later, the Museum of Fine Arts, endowed by James and Julia Gray of Springfield, opened to the public. Both museums house broad collections, particularly strong in American art. The Smith Painting Gallery shows 19th century works purchased by George Walter Vincent Smith. The Museum of Fine Arts displays works by period in separate galleries that show the art of the present and the art of the past. Two family portraits in the 18th century gallery reflect the state of art in a young nation when self-taught itinerant artists traveled the countryside in search of commissions.
The Parsons family and the Nicholson family, they were painted by artists with two very different backgrounds. The Parsons family is reflective of the itinerant portrait tradition. Anson Parsons owned a large spa in New York State. During the height of his prosperity, he had this portrait painter come in and paint his family. The itinerant artist's goal was to paint a face and get the facial features. The body wasn't as important. Everything in the picture is given equal emphasis, so it has almost a surreal look to it. This abstract quality is what attracted a lot of 20th century people to this kind of naive art.
The Nicholson family portrait was painted by Ralph Earl, a European-trained artist capable of a much more sophisticated style. But, perhaps to suit the Nicholsons, he chose to paint this portrait in simpler fashion.
They wouldn't have appreciated a European-style art, and so he purposefully made his art look a little more naive for his patrons.
The gallery also shows examples of work by the most famous artists of the day: Rembrandt Peale, Gilbert Stuart, and John Singleton Copley, who painted this portrait of Boston Judge Nymphis Marston. Copley ignored the background, then animated the painting by playing light against shadow on the judge's face.
The use of this sharp raking light allows the artist to explore all these different textures in the picture. The brass buttons, the polished wooden table, the reflection of the paper in the table even. This was one of Copley's great skills as an artist. The viewer feels like he's walked into a room and interrupted him at his work. He's sort of slightly turned in space and looking out, meeting the viewer's gaze.
In a way, the viewer has just walked into Marston's room. He owned most of this furniture. The silver tea service was forged by Benjamin Burt from Marston's own coins.
There were no silver deposits in the colonies. When a patron wanted a silver tea service or silverware, they used coins. They would turn in their coins to the goldsmith, for instance Benjamin Burt or Paul Revere, and would have a nice silver tea service made for themselves. And in a way, this was a lot like having a savings account that you would then pass on to your children and your grandchildren.
This was Nymphis Marston's teapot, an 18th century work of art turned everyday object. By the 19th century, American artists were transforming everyday objects into works of art. Raphael Peale turned the humble melon into a study of texture on canvas. William Merritt Chase created a field of contrast in his still life with ginger jar, pumpkin, and samovar. Chase was an American impressionist, a painter now famous for his landscapes. It was in his still life work that he honed his craft. If you can paint a pot, he said, you can paint an angel.
If you can paint something well, you can paint anything well. And what he was trying to do in these still lifes is paint even the most everyday objects, the most everyday things you would find in the kitchen. He was painting them well and making them beautiful.
One of the things that we wanted was a 19th century fruit and flower painting. We actually went out on the market, and we were very fortunate to find the Severin Rosen, which is this huge, grand Baroque painting that is almost the centerpiece of our 19th century American gallery.
Although Severin Rosen was painting for a popular market, he included details to remind us that while art might last forever, life does not. Insects feed on decay, grapes wilt on the plate, and the champagne bubbles will disappear all too soon. For all its abundance, the painting is a reminder of life's one certainty: change.
In the late 19th century, when these pictures were painted, there was a certain national obsession with reality and illusion. Is it real or is it not real?
We specialize in trompe-l'oeil, which was very popular in the 19th century. The artist in trompe-l'oeil was trying to create a painting that looks so realistic that the viewer would actually think that they were looking at objects.
The painter William Michael Harnett was a precisionist and a pack rat. Throughout his life, he collected old things to use in his trompe-l'oeil paintings. "I want my models to have the mellowing effect of age," he said.
The objects in the picture are rendered with exquisite precision. You can read lettering, you can play the music, the sheet music.
In fact, the sheet music was, to Harnett, deeply personal. It was Papageno's song from Mozart's The Magic Flute. In it, Papageno says he plans to catch a wife. Harnett married soon after he finished the painting. After Harnett died in 1882, John Haberly became the leader of the trompe-l'oeil still life school. He started his career painting scraps of paper, including paper money.
He was once arrested by the agents of the Treasury Department for producing a picture of dollar bills, only to have the federal Treasury agents embarrassed by seeing that it was merely painted.
For a decade, Haberly produced popular trompe-l'oeil featuring the stuff of everyday life. A Springfield tavern owner bought this painting, called A Favorite, from Gill's Gallery and hung it in the saloon lobby.
Then his eyesight went bad, and so towards the end of his career, he painted the Japanese corner. The most successful trompe-l'oeil item in that picture is the little envelope which is pinned to the screen which says "Do Not Touch." That seems to just come off the surface of the canvas. And the little note is a reminder to everyone that he still hadn't lost his skills as the trompe-l'oeil artist.
But a Japanese corner also depicts America's wild enthusiasm for decorative objects from Japan and China. At the same time that George Walter Vincent Smith was buying Asian exports, American painters routinely added Asian touches to their work. In Studio T, Julian Weir put his model in a kimono before a Japanese screen. Winslow Homer, in his 1880 painting, Promenade on the Beach, painted one of the women holding a Japanese fan. The composition is as stark as a Japanese print and as mysterious.
Homer actually had to explain this painting to George Walter Vincent Smith because there were a few people who were a bit concerned that these two women were unchaperoned and they were on a beach. And Homer had to write back and say that these women were of good virtue.
The reason why Promenade on the Beach is so important to his career is because it really marks a turning point. What's represented in Promenade on the Beach and what you begin to see more and more in his work is the struggle between man and nature, particularly nature represented by the sea.
Man and nature was a prominent theme for the 19th century landscape painters known as the Hudson River School. From 1825 on, these artists drew their inspiration from American nature and turned their backs on the classical ancient ruins that inspired so many European painters.
America has no ruins. Nothing in America is old. For example, the oldest houses in New England are 17th century. What is that? That's nothing when you compare that to Roman ruins that are 2,000 years old. What's old in America? The landscape. What's old in America is Niagara Falls, Yosemite, Grand Canyon.
In 1851, Frederick Church, one of the leading Hudson River School artists, created New England scenery, a cosmic landscape that depicts not one spot in New England, but all of New England. The Maine woods, the mountains of New Hampshire and Vermont, the waterways of the Northeast, and human features, a sawmill and a Conestoga wagon.
That, of course, would represent American ingenuity, but at the same time, it represents the industrialization of the American landscape. It's laudatory and cautionary at the same time.
Early American landscape painters painted almost exclusively New England. The next generation went further and further and further looking for the exotic landscape.
There was this really romantic idea of travel in these far-off places. The William Bradford really expressed polar passion. You get a sense of the desolation of the polar region, as well as the beauty of the scene.
Even the most pastoral landscape was rich in symbolism. George Inness's Clearing Up shows lifting clouds thought to signify the end of the Civil War in America. Genre painters who depicted scenes of everyday life also marked the war's end symbolically. Smith collected paintings of children by the genre artist John George Brown, paintings that today appear sentimental, but at the time struck a deep chord.
There's a kind of desperation in America to kind of recover an innocence. People that are war-weary, they want to kind of almost fantasize about the next generation who's growing up innocent, not knowing the horrors of the Civil War.
But the Fine Arts Museum has one history painting that takes on not only the horrors of the Civil War, but of many of the tumultuous and bloody episodes in the American past. History is presented as sculpture in a picture of a massive monument made up of 10 towers, each built upon a marble base and connected by an ethereal network of rail. This is the historical monument of the American Republic, painted in a barn in Leverett, Massachusetts by folk artist Erastus Salisbury Field.
It took 20 years to paint, and as far as we can tell, Field worked on it fitfully. He started shortly after the Civil War, and certainly looking at the picture, you get a sense of his intense emotional reaction to the Civil War. He added more canvas to the right and left side in the 1880s. I don't know how long he would have kept up with this, but it could have just expanded infinitely, more and more towers, more and more history.
Field's history unfolds in a loose pattern that shows the good and the bad in America's past. Each scene is numbered. The first is the Settlement of Jamestown in 1607, a vigorous scene of clearing and building that contrasts with the violence of number 3, which shows Pocahontas pleading to save John Smith, or number 7, which graphically lays out the Roanoke Massacre.
This may be one scene from the Revolution here, but if we were to look for, let's say, another scene of, let's say, Washington resigning from the army, we'd have to go look way up here near the top of this particular tower. The point being that all American history is not confined to any one time or any one place, but it stretches out and it touches all other aspects of American history.
Field was a Calvinist, a religious man troubled by slavery. In one scene, lynched slaves hang lifeless from the very pillars that support the monument. Above them, Satan presides, winged and triumphant over the American South.
The centerpiece of the entire picture is the assassination of Lincoln. We see Lincoln head on. To the left is John Wilkes Booth, gun in hand, But on the far right is a figure of George Washington who holds one hand up in the air in horror at the event that he sees in front of him. And he's not painted as some shadowy figure or a ghost-like presence, but he seems real, he seems palpable. In this sort of Calvinistic way of thinking of history, he was present at the event. There are 300 scenes from American history here. It is an ambitious, even an audacious painting. I could even claim that it's the most ambitious American painting ever painted. Nothing really quite exceeds it in its scope and in its vision.
Erastus Field completed the painting in 1888. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the works of major painters of the day, and it was largely ignored. After his death in 1900, the painting was stored in the family attic and eventually put out in the barn. In 1940, the painting was again exhibited, and in 1960, it was donated to the Springfield Museum of Fine Arts. In 1886, Springfield celebrated its 250th anniversary. Chester Chapin, president of the Boston and Albany Railroad, commissioned Augustus St. Gaudens to create a life-size sculpture of Chapin's ancestor, Deacon Samuel Chapin. The Puritan proved a masterpiece. It proved popular as well. St. Gaudens reduced the size and cast dozens for an American market eager for symbols of its vanishing past. In 1895, the artist Frederick Remington did the same.
Remington was one of the most successful sculptors at the turn of the century, not only because he was so daring with his imagery, but also because he took the bronze casting process to new heights. He almost turned a sculpture on a dare. He was in the studio of a friend, Frederick Ruxtall, and he was working on an equestrian statue. And Remington said, "I think I could do this." He daringly put this horse on its rear legs. It really presented a challenge for the founders who were going to be casting this piece.
The sculptures in the 19th century gallery represent a divided inheritance. The Puritan and the Bronco Buster are American symbols cast in American bronze. William Henry Reinhardt's marble reliefs, Morning and Evening, carved in European marble, refer to sculpture's roots in the classical past. In the early 20th century gallery, the works again are bronze. Anna Hyatt Huntington's study, Goats Fighting, and Malvina Hoffman's Bill Working.
Malvina Hoffman chose the subject matter of her caretaker, Big Bill. What you see here really is a genre portrait. Hoffman has included all sorts of little narrative details, from the wilting cigarette in his mouth to the big rag to the pail next to him. This is a portrait that is glorifying work, that says it's okay to get down on your hands and knees and get sweaty and dirty and make things clean.
Many of the works in the early 20th century gallery were acquired at about the time the Art Museum opened. The paintings show the artistic divergence of the time. On one hand, the modern influence of Cubism. On the other, an adherence to the old master tradition.
Early directors of this museum had a very clear sense of what was important in art, what art means, and how to buy it. They bought Isabel Bishop, Charles Sheeler, a Feininger, an early Coke, one of Paul Sample's first Vermont pictures. It was so wise to have bought the paintings that they bought, to buy one of Georgia O'Keeffe's Western landscapes. That was a very good idea. Georgia O'Keeffe started making landscape in the late 20s and early 30s. She liked this purity of line and the simplicity that the hills actually have, so that she reduced the detail on them, but at the same time, she kept them very naturalistic, very true to what they really do look like.
Charles Sheeler's painting of the Ephrata Cloister is realistic, in a way. He had seen the buildings only when they were in ruin, but he chose to paint them as new, almost cubist. Every line is perfectly plumb, every stone in place. John Coke, influenced by the French master Auguste Renoir, painted an elegant picture of swimming at a Vermont quarry. Paul Sample gives us a very different view of Vermont.
Paul Sample was working in the regionalist or American scene look of the time, in that it shows everyday life in America, middle America at play. They're supposed to be at a church supper, but there's not a look of plenty. They respond in various ways to the Blonde Bombshell, who has just brought herself in, exposing a great deal of her body.
The Blonde Bombshell was an archetype that resonated in American art in the 1930s. Reginald Marsh painted one on a carousel, a modern portrait with clear connections to the past.
Everything is Baroque. The twisted pose to the full fleshy body, the little puttee, the horse's mane. Marsh specialized in these 1930s blonde bombshell types. Notice that the ideal of beauty in the 30s was not skinny beauty. It was plump, in the Rubens mode. I like that a lot.
The Contemporary Gallery shows the explosion of forms seen in art today. There are figurative paintings showing global influences, abstract works, modern sculpture, and contemporary realist paintings from a tradition particularly strong in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts.
Randy Diehl is an example of this realist tradition. We have a work of his called Self-Portrait in a Pool Hall, where he super saturates the color. So it's almost super realism at this point.
The sculpture in the gallery is abstract, but one piece evokes an animal image. Richard Stankowitz's Untitled work from 1961 is oddly reminiscent of a rooster.
Stankowicz was actually digging in his backyard and came upon this rusted junk and was taking these sort of found objects out of context and putting it together in these different sort of whimsical configurations and compositions.
Aspects of Alexander Calder's Black Diamond are equally whimsical. The color change, the floating mobile quality.
Calder got interested in the whole idea of movement. He uses the mobile element, this sort of moving, kinetic aspect to the sculpture. You know, you can't go in and push it, but often if there's a little breeze, you can see how these pieces move and kind of work with each other.
In a way, the American collection in Springfield is in motion. Exhibits change, new pieces appear. At any given time, upwards of 250 works of American art can be seen on the Quadrangle in Springfield.
Even though we're small, we hold many treasures. The implication is, if you're a small museum, that your collection is also small and therefore insignificant. And in our case, that's not at all true. We might be small, but the paintings in our galleries are true treasures.
Thank you.